Chapter 1. The Empire before him. When power spoke in fear. Before you can understand what Cyrus did, you have to understand what the world felt like before he did it. Not the politics, not the geography, the feeling. Picture yourself in a city that has just been conquered. Not any city. Your city. The place where your children were born. Where your parents are buried. Where you know the name of every street and the face of every neighbor and the smell of the market in the morning. An army has come. The fighting is over. And now you are waiting to find out what happens to people like you in a world like this. In the ancient world, you did not have to wait long. The answer had been given many times before, in many cities, across many generations. And the answer was always the same. The Assyrians had perfected it. When an Assyrian king conquered a city, he did not simply take it and leave. He recorded what he did to it. He had scribes write it down in language that did not soften anything. He had artists carve the record into stone. He placed those carvings where people would see them, in palaces and temples and public squares, so that the memory of what conquest looked like would never fade from the minds of any population that might be considering resistance. The inscriptions did not speak in euphemism. One Assyrian king described himself as the flood of the great storm. Another called himself the one who burns cities like fire from heaven. These were not metaphors chosen carelessly. They were communications designed to travel faster than any army, to arrive in cities that had not yet been reached, to do the work of making resistance feel impossible before a single soldier appeared at the gate. And it worked, for generations, across vast territories. It worked. But here is the thing about ruling through fear, that empires built on it consistently underestimated. Fear is expensive. It requires continuous renewal. Every generation that grows up without witnessing the original act of violence has to be shown a new one. Or the fear softens, and softened fear does not produce the paralysis that pure fear produces. It produces something more dangerous. It produces resentment that waits. The deportation policy was the most sophisticated expression of this system. When the Assyrians conquered a population, they moved it, deliberately, at enormous scale, across distances that guaranteed the displaced people would arrive in a world where nothing was familiar. Then they filled the emptied territory with people from somewhere else entirely. The logic was precise. You cannot organize resistance when you do not know the land. You cannot build networks when everyone around you is a stranger. You cannot hold on to your identity when the place that made you who you are has been given to someone else. It was not chaos. It was engineering. Babylon inherited this model and added a dimension to it. Nebuchadnezzar understood that terror alone produced a ceiling on what was achievable. The populations you terrorized complied but did not cooperate. They gave you what they had to give and hid everything else. They performed the minimum that safety required and invested their remaining energy in surviving until something changed. He understood that you needed terror and grandeur together. The people beneath you had to feel not just afraid but small. And the way to make people feel small was not only through violence, it was through scale. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was the expression of that understanding made physical. The walls, the gates covered in glazed blue brick, the ziggurat rising above everything, the processional way through the center of the city. These were not just architecture. They were arguments about which city sat at the center of the universe, about which gods were powerful, about which king had divine approval and which populations had been found wanting. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and brought its people to Babylon, he was making a theological argument as much as a political one. He was saying, your God did not protect you. My gods are here, in these temples, in this city. This is what power looks like. This is where the world is organized from. And the people he brought to Babylon had to live inside that argument every day. For 50 years, they built houses there because there was nowhere else to live. They learned the language because they needed to eat. They navigated the commercial and social structures of a city that had been built entirely to demonstrate that everything they believed about themselves was wrong. But they did not forget Jerusalem. That is the thing that the architects of this system consistently underestimated. You can move a people. You can take their land and their temple and their king and their institutions. You can surround them with strangers and make their original home a distant memory. But you cannot take away the story they tell about who they are. That story goes with them. It lives in the way they name their children, in the prayers they say in a language the city around them does not speak, in the specific texture of grief that passes from one generation to the next, not as information, but as identity. By the rivers of Babylon, the psalm says, there we sat and wept. When we remembered Zion, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That is not poetry about a political situation. That is poetry about a specific kind of wound. The wound of people being asked to perform their wholeness in a place where their particular wholeness is homeless. For decades, that wound had nowhere to go. And nobody in the ancient world, not a single ruler in the long history of empires that preceded Cyrus, had ever thought to ask the question that would change everything. Not how do I stop these people from leaving, but what would make them want to stay? There is a difference between those two questions that sounds small and is enormous. The first question leads to walls, to surveillance, to the management of populations through threat and consequence. It works, up to a point. For as long as the threat is credible and the enforcement is functioning, and then it stops working, all at once, in a way that no one inside the system saw coming. The second question leads somewhere else entirely. A man from the edge of the world that the Assyrians and Babylonians had built was about to find out where. He had spent his entire life learning how to ask it. Chapter 2. The man from the edge. There is a specific kind of education that does not happen in palaces. It happens at the margins, in the places where the great powers of the world press against smaller ones, and the pressure of that contact teaches you things that no one at the center ever has to learn. Because at the center, power explains itself. It does not need to justify its existence. It simply is. And the people who grow up inside it develop a relationship with its logic that is too close for clear vision. At the edge, you learn to see what the center cannot see about itself. Cyrus grew up at the edge. Persia, in the early 6th century BC, was not a world power. It was not even close. It was a collection of tribes and settlements in the southwestern part of what we now call Iran, in a region the Babylonians and Medes barely thought about, except when they needed to count tributaries. The family Cyrus was born into had managed a careful and unglamorous survival across generations. They paid tribute to the Medes when the Medes required it, which was often. They maintained enough military capacity to defend their immediate territory. They did not make large claims about themselves. He was a boy in a small kingdom, watching a large empire collect what it was owed. The Median officials who came to collect tribute were not cruel men. Particularly, they were administrators. They arrived with their records and their expectations and their manner of moving through a room that communicated, without any explicit statement, that the room and everyone in it existed at their sufferance. They spoke in the register of people who had never needed to wonder whether the power they represented was real. It simply was. It had always been. It would always be, and the men around Cyrus, his father, and the nobles, and the officials who served his family, became different when those Median administrators were present. Not dramatically different, subtly different. The kind of different that a boy watching closely could notice precisely because it was not meant to be noticed. The language shifted. The posture shifted. Opinions that had been expressed freely an hour before were suddenly absent from the conversation. Men who commanded genuine respect within the Persian world became, in the presence of the Median officials, a carefully managed version of themselves. They performed deference with the practiced ease of people who had been performing it their entire lives and had learned to perform it so smoothly that the performance was almost invisible. Almost. Cyrus watched this, and he noticed the gap. The gap between what these men were when the Median officials were present and what they were when the Median officials were gone, between the authority that the empire claimed over them and the authority it could actually enforce in any given room on any given day, between the performance of submission and the reality of what the people performing it actually thought and felt and wanted. He was not yet old enough to do anything with what he was seeing. He was just watching, building, without knowing he was building it. A library of observation about how power actually worked as opposed to how it presented itself, and what he was seeing, year after year, visit after visit, was something that no one at the center of the Median Empire had any incentive to notice. The empire was not as solid as it looked, not because it was weak militarily. The Median army was capable and had proven itself capable many times. The empire was not solid in the way that matters more than military strength, which is in the genuine commitment of the people inside it. The Median nobles and officials and military commanders who served Astyages did so because the alternative was worse. Not because they believed in what they were serving. That is a very specific kind of loyalty, and it has a very specific weakness. It holds as long as the alternative remains clearly worse. The moment someone offers a credible alternative, the calculation changes. Astyages had been ruling for decades, and he had spent those decades doing the specific thing that erodes the calculation without ever quite triggering open resistance. He had made choices that accumulated into resentment. He had governed the people closest to him, the military commanders, the noble families, the administrative class, in a way that produced deference but not devotion. He had treated their support as something he was owed rather than something he needed to continuously earn. From the edge of the Median world, Cyrus could see this clearly. From the center, it was invisible. Systems that have been running for a long time develop a specific kind of blindness to their own fragility. The people inside them mistake the absence of visible resistance for genuine stability. They cannot see the resentment that is not expressing itself because the calculation has not yet changed. They cannot see the loyalty that is actually compliance, waiting for a better option. Cyrus could see it. He had been watching it his entire life through the specific lens of someone who was inside the system as a subject, but outside it as a genuine participant. He paid tribute, but he was not invested in the system that collected it. He observed, but he did not belong. That position, uncomfortable as it was, gave him something that the most powerful men in the Median court did not have. He could see the building from outside and notice that it leaned. The ancient sources that describe his early life are full of legend. Herodotus, writing more than a generation after Cyrus lived, gives us dreams and prophecies and the kinds of details that belong to stories about people who later became extraordinary. A Median king dreaming of catastrophe. A destiny recognized in a child's games. These are the stories that cultures tell about people who changed the world. The stories that make the extraordinary feel inevitable rather than achieved. But the real story of how Cyrus became Cyrus is more interesting than any prophecy. It is the story of a specific kind of attention paid over a lifetime. The attention of someone who grew up in a position where observation was the only power available to him, who turned that observation into a comprehensive map of how the world he was born into actually worked, and who waited, with the patience of a man who understood that the right moment and the wrong moment were not always obvious in advance. For the map to become useful, by the time he was ready to test the Median Empire, he already knew where it would break. He had been watching it lean for years, and one morning, the question he had been preparing for his entire life was no longer hypothetical. The moment had arrived, not because fate delivered it, because he had been patient enough to let it. Chapter 3. Media, the first lesson. The rebellion began around 553 BC. There was no single moment of declaration, no speech, no dramatic crossing of a line in the sand. What happened between Cyrus and the Median Empire was less like a war beginning and more like a pressure becoming too great for the container holding it. Cyrus moved north with his Persian forces. Astyages sent his army to meet him. And here is where something happened that the ancient world had no framework for understanding. The Median army switched sides. Not all of it, but enough. Harpagus, one of the senior Median commanders, turned his forces over to Cyrus in the middle of the campaign. Other officers followed. The army that Astyages had sent to crush a tributary rebellion became, before anyone had time to process what was happening, part of the force that was taking him down. Herodotus tells us that Harpagus had a personal grievance against Astyages, a deep and specific one, the kind that does not fade over years, but becomes more precise with time, more settled, more patient. Whether the specific details Herodotus records are accurate is uncertain. What is not uncertain is the shape of what happened. A Median general decided, in the moment when the decision mattered most, that the man on the other side of the field represented something worth crossing over for. Armies do not make that decision based on ideology. They make it based on calculation. And the calculation they made in 553 BC tells you everything you need to know about what Cyrus had been communicating, quietly and consistently. In the years before the campaign began, he had been making it clear that a different arrangement was possible, not through grand speeches, through the patient, specific work of making people feel that their interests and his interests were pointing in the same direction, through the demonstration that the men who joined him would be valued according to what they could do rather than what position they had always been assigned. He had been building, without announcing what he was building, the thing that Astyages had been slowly destroying, the belief that loyalty was worth something to the person who received it. Astyages was captured. He was not executed, not humiliated publicly in the manner that the world had been taught to expect. He was kept, present enough to be seen, controlled enough to pose no threat. Every general and noble and administrator who had served him watched what happened to him after his defeat and drew a conclusion. Survival was possible. That conclusion was not accidental. It was the message, and messages of that kind, delivered in the language of actual events rather than words, travel through a population with a speed and a credibility that no proclamation can match. And then Cyrus did something that the ancient world had even less framework for than the battle itself. He walked into the Median administrative structure and kept it running. The officials who had made the empire function under Astyages continued to make it function. Now they were making it function for someone else. The cultural practices of the Median people were not targeted for elimination. The temples continued. The markets opened the morning after his forces arrived, looking almost exactly as they had the morning before. He absorbed media. He did not replace it. To the populations who had lived under Median rule and now found themselves under Persian rule, the transition felt less like conquest and more like a change in management. The fundamental structure of daily life had not been destroyed. What had changed was the name that the tribute went to and the face that appeared at the top of the system. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was something colder and more deliberate than kindness. It was the recognition that a population that has had its world destroyed is a liability. It requires management. It generates resistance that has to be continuously suppressed. It demands resources that could be spent elsewhere. A population that has been allowed to keep its world intact is a population with something to lose under your rule. And populations with something to lose are, paradoxically, the easiest populations to govern, because they will cooperate with a system that protects what they value, even a system they did not choose, because the alternative is something they would rather not risk. Cyrus was not the first ruler to understand this in theory. He was the first to apply it consistently, at scale, as a governing principle rather than an occasional exception. But beneath the surface of his success in media, a question was already forming, a question he had not yet been forced to answer. Media had been primed for this moment. The grievances were real. The disaffection was widespread. The conditions had made his approach look almost inevitable. Astyages had alienated the very people who would have needed to defend him. And when the moment came, those people had made a different calculation. But what would happen when Cyrus walked into a world where the conditions were different? Where the king was not universally resented? Where the population had not been waiting for a reason to transfer its loyalty? Where the only thing waiting for him on the other side was a city that had decided it was going to resist? To the west, a king named Croesus had heard what happened to Astyages. He was not going to wait for Cyrus to come to him. He was going to move first. Chapter 4. Croesus and the Limits of Wealth. There is a word in the English language that has survived for more than 2,500 years because nothing has come along to replace it. When we say someone is as rich as Croesus, we are reaching back across 25 centuries to a king whose wealth was so far beyond ordinary scale that his name became the permanent shorthand for having more than anyone could reasonably need. That kind of linguistic survival tells you something real about the impression the man made on the world that encountered him. Croesus ruled Lydia from his capital at Sardis. In the western part of what is now Turkey, the Lydians are credited with developing coinage in ways that transformed how the ancient world thought about wealth and exchange. Croesus was the apex of that transformation. He gave gifts to the oracle at Delphi on a scale that ancient sources describe with the specific awe reserved for things almost too large to be believed. He had extended Lydian power across a significant portion of western Anatolia. He had allies in Egypt and Sparta and Babylon, by every measure available to the ancient world. He was one of the most secure rulers alive. He heard about Astyages. He heard about how quickly the Median Empire, which had seemed permanent, had dissolved around a Persian king that nobody had been taking seriously. He heard about the speed of the campaign and the manner of the victory and the specific way that Cyrus had handled what came after, and he made a decision that would define his legacy for the rest of human history. He decided to move against Cyrus before Cyrus could move against him. He consulted the oracle at Delphi. He sent rich offerings and asked a precise question. If he marched against the Persian king, what would happen? The oracle answered that if Croesus crossed the Halys River and attacked, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus heard what he wanted to hear. He did not ask which empire. He assembled his forces, crossed into territory that had been Median and was now Persian, and prepared for a campaign that would, he was certain, stop this new power before it reached his borders. The initial campaign was inconclusive. A battle was fought. Neither side broke decisively. Croesus pulled back to Sardis for the winter, sending word to his allies to join him in the spring for a renewed campaign. He dismissed his mercenary soldiers. He began the process of standing down his forces and preparing for the following season. He assumed Cyrus would do what armies did in that era: disengage, rest, wait for spring. Cyrus did not wait. He pushed forward at a pace that no one in Sardis had anticipated, covering ground that should have taken months in weeks. Reaching Lydia before Croesus had time to reassemble his forces or recall his allies or do anything other than face what was coming with what he had. The battle outside Sardis ended with Croesus captured and the city taken. And then Cyrus did not kill him. Croesus was placed on the pyre. The wood had been built high. The crowd assembled to witness this. The soldiers, the officers, the Lydian nobles who had surrendered and were now watching their king at the center of everything about to consume him, stood at a distance that was not quite far enough for any of them to feel comfortable. Cyrus stood closer. He watched Croesus on the pyre. He watched the fire beginning to catch at the edges of the wood. He watched the man who had been the wealthiest and most powerful ruler in the Western world 3 months ago, standing there in the way that men stand when they have accepted that what is coming cannot be stopped. And then Croesus said a name, not a prayer, not a plea, a name. Solon, the name of an Athenian lawmaker who had visited Croesus years before, at the height of his wealth and power, and had said something to him that Croesus had not understood at the time, that no man should be counted happy until his life was over, that the reversals life produces do not announce themselves in advance, that the distance between the height of fortune and the bottom of it was not as great as it appeared from the top. Cyrus asked what the condemned man was saying. When it was explained, he stood there for a moment that the sources cannot give us access to, the moment between hearing something and deciding what to do about it. The fire was catching. The wood was starting to go. There was a crowd watching and an empire to demonstrate the power of and a message to send to every other city, still calculating whether resistance was worth the cost. And in that moment, something shifted, whether it was the lesson itself, the recognition that the man on the pyre could have been him under different circumstances, at a different turn of the wheel that history runs on, whether it was something more strategic, the sudden calculation of what a living Croesus was worth compared to a dead one, whether it was something he could not have fully articulated even to himself. We do not know. What we know is what he did. He gave the order to extinguish the fire. He kept Croesus alive, not as a prisoner in chains, not displayed as a trophy of conquest, as a person whose experience and knowledge had value, a man who had governed the wealthiest kingdom in the Western world, who understood the Greek cities of Anatolia from the inside, who could tell those cities things about the new power from the East that no Persian officer could tell them. There are traditions of Croesus becoming an advisor to Cyrus, someone whose understanding of Western politics and Greek culture was useful to a Persian king, extending his reach into unfamiliar territory. Whether that specific advisory relationship is historically precise or partly legendary, the underlying pattern is consistent with everything else we know about how Cyrus operated. He did not collect trophies. He collected people. A dead Croesus was a demonstration of Persian power. A living Croesus who moved within the Persian court, who could be seen functioning and not humiliated, who could tell the Greek cities of Anatolia that submission to Cyrus was survivable, was something more valuable than a demonstration. He was evidence, and every general and noble and official who watched what happened to Croesus after his defeat drew the same conclusion that the Median commanders had drawn after Astyages. Survival was possible. That conclusion, delivered again in the language of actual events, traveled through the Greek cities of Anatolia with the specific credibility that only things that actually happened carry. The cities that had been watching what happened at Sardis very carefully now had an answer to the question they had been asking. What kind of ruler is this going to be? Not a comfortable answer. They were still subjects of a power they had not chosen. But the answer contained something different from the pure threat that the Assyrian model communicated. And that difference mattered in ways that would compound over time, in ways that Cyrus was beginning to understand, and that most rulers never learned to calculate. For the Greek world more broadly, the encounter with Croesus produced something else, something that would travel farther and last longer than the campaign itself. Cyrus had entered the Greek imagination, not just as a conqueror, as a figure who raised questions that the Greek world found itself unable to stop thinking about, questions about the nature of power, about the relationship between wealth and wisdom, about what it meant to be at the top of the world and still be subject to forces you cannot control, about what kind of ruler could defeat the richest king alive and then choose not to kill him. Xenophon, writing generations later, would use Cyrus as the central figure in a work called the Cyropedia. It is important to understand what that work is. It is not biography. It is a political and philosophical portrait of ideal kingship, using the figure of Cyrus as the frame on which Xenophon hung his own ideas about leadership and the nature of legitimate power. The Cyrus of the Cyropedia is partly the historical figure and partly what the Greek world needed him to be: patient, generous, capable of inspiring loyalty rather than just demanding it. That portrait would travel through Rome and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, until it sat on Thomas Jefferson's shelf while he was thinking about what governance should look like, until it shaped the language that American founders used to talk about the relationship between leaders and the people they led. All of that began here. In the moment, Cyrus stood before a pyre and gave an order that none of the people watching expected him to give, but east of Lydia, the greatest city in the world, was watching, and Babylon's calculations were different from anything Cyrus had navigated before. Chapter 5. The Road to Babylon. Babylon was not just a city. To understand what Cyrus was moving toward, you have to understand what Babylon meant in 539 BC, not as geography, but as argument. The argument that civilization had a center, that the gods had chosen a specific location as the place where divine will and human power met most completely, that the king who held Babylon held not just territory, but the endorsement of the universe itself. Every empire that had risen to genuine greatness in the ancient Near East had understood this. You were not truly the ruler of the world until you held Babylon, not because of its population, though it was the largest city on earth, not because of its walls, though they were the most formidable ever built, because of what Babylon meant in the shared imagination of the ancient world, Nebuchadnezzar had made Babylon into a physical expression of that meaning. The Ishtar Gate, its surface covered in brilliant blue glazed brick, decorated with bulls and dragons in raised relief, was not just an entrance to a city, it was a declaration about the nature of reality. The processional way leading from the gate through the heart of the city was a theological statement made out of stone and color and scale. The ziggurat, rising above everything else, was a model of the universe, made architectural, the axis around which the world organized itself. You walked through Babylon and felt the argument before your mind could articulate it. Then Nebuchadnezzar died. The kings who came after him were smaller than the city they had inherited, not necessarily in their ambitions, but in their ability to fill the space that Babylon required from its rulers. The specific combination of military authority and theological legitimacy and visible devotion to the traditions of the city that made a king of Babylon feel like the real thing. By the time Nabonidus came to power in 556 BC, the gap between what Babylon claimed to be and what its king was capable of sustaining had become impossible to ignore from inside. Nabonidus was not incompetent in the ordinary sense. He was a man of genuine intellectual and religious conviction, but his convictions led him in directions that were catastrophic for his position. He was devoted to the moon god Sin in a way that went beyond the political management of religion that most ancient kings practiced. He elevated Sin above Marduk in ways that the theology of Babylon had no room for. He disrupted the Akitu festival, the annual ceremony through which the relationship between king and the city's patron god was renewed and the king's legitimacy was publicly reconfirmed. He left Babylon itself for extended periods, sometimes years at a time, relocating to an oasis city in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia, for reasons that ancient sources describe differently and that historians have debated ever since. The reasons matter less than the effects. The priesthood of Marduk was one of the most powerful institutional bodies in the ancient Near East. It controlled enormous agricultural estates. It managed the economic infrastructure of the temple complex. Intertwined with the broader commercial life of the city, it had its own administrative systems, its own networks of communication, its own accumulated weight of institutional authority built across centuries of being the mechanism through which divine legitimacy flowed to Babylonian kings. And it had developed, over years of Nabonidus's theological provocations and extended absences, a dissatisfaction that had nowhere productive to go. A king who has alienated his own temple establishment has done something more serious than create political opposition. He has broken the mechanism through which his legitimacy was continuously produced and publicly renewed. Every ritual he fails to perform is a payment he is not making into the account of divine endorsement that his rule depends on. Every disruption to the proper order of things that bears his name is a withdrawal from a balance that the people of the city can feel depleting, even when they cannot fully articulate what they are feeling. By 540 BC, Nabonidus had returned to Babylon, aware that the Persian threat from the east was real and growing. He brought back to the city the statues of gods from surrounding towns and cities. A defensive move intended to concentrate divine protection in the capital. This action, meant to strengthen Babylon, had the opposite effect on the populations whose gods had been relocated. They did not experience it as protection. They experienced it as a second disruption, a second act of the same disrespect that had been offending the sensibility of the city's religious world for years. He was accumulating enemies the way a man accumulates debts when he stops paying attention to the interest. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods where the Jewish community had built its life across 2 generations of exile, something else had been building for years. The people who had been brought here by Nebuchadnezzar had not dissolved into Babylon the way deportation was supposed to make them dissolve. They had built lives in this city. Yes, they had learned the language and navigated the commercial structures and established themselves with enough stability that some families had found genuine success within Babylonian society. Later documents show Jewish families integrated into the economic life of Mesopotamia at sophisticated levels, but they had maintained, with a fierceness that the city around them never fully understood, the thing that made them who they were, not the temple, which was gone, not the land, which was far away, but the story, the specific theological conviction that what had happened to them was not the end of the story, that the God who had allowed exile to happen had not thereby ceased to be God, that the promises contained in their tradition had not been voided by the destruction of the building that had housed them. They had developed, in exile, a form of Jewish life that was portable in a way it had never needed to be before. Sabbath observance, prayer, the study and transmission of texts that carried their history and their understanding of who they were. They had found the essence of their identity, the things that would survive without the physical structures that had previously contained them, and the prophetic tradition alive in their community had not gone quiet. The texts that scholars associate with 2nd Isaiah were being written or compiled in this period, and in those texts something extraordinary appeared, a name. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to open doors before him that gates may not be closed. Isaiah 45 continues, I call you by your name. Though you do not know me, that phrase carries its own astonishment inside it. The God of Israel explicitly acknowledging that Cyrus does not worship him, does not belong to the covenant, does not know the theological framework that is using him as its instrument, and reaching across that distance anyway, grasping his hand anyway, directing his steps anyway. That text was circulating in the Jewish community of Babylon while Cyrus was still on the other side of the horizon, before he had done anything specifically for them, before they had received any communication from his court, on the basis only of what his campaign had already demonstrated. The people who had been watching his treatment of Media and Lydia, reading it through the framework of their own tradition, were concluding something that even his own people had not fully articulated. They were concluding that this man was different from the kings they had known, and they were beginning, carefully, with the restraint of people who have learned not to extend hope too far too quickly, to believe that different might be enough. Now consider what Cyrus knew as he moved toward Babylon. He knew that the city was the greatest prize in the ancient world. Symbolically and materially, he knew that taking it would transform his position in ways that no previous campaign had. A man who held Babylon was not a regional power. He was the ruler of the world's center. He also knew that the city was not waiting for him in the posture of unified resistance. His intelligence had given him a picture of Babylon that was more complicated than a city preparing to defend itself. He knew about the priestly establishment of Marduk and its accumulated grievances against Nabonidus. He knew about the disrupted rituals and the absent king and the specific theological wound that had been opening in the city's religious foundations for years. He knew that Babylon was a city with a fracture in it, and he had spent enough years thinking about how power actually worked to understand something that most military commanders never considered. A fracture is not a weakness you exploit by hitting it harder. A fracture is an opening, and what you put into an opening determines everything that happens next. He could put a Persian army through the fracture and take the city by force. The walls were formidable, but not impregnable. The siege would be costly, and the resistance would be fierce, and the city that emerged from the other side of it would be a damaged thing. suspicious and traumatized and requiring continuous management. Or he could put something else through the fracture. He could put a story, the specific story that Babylon had been waiting to hear. The story that the fracture itself was evidence of. The story that the city's own theology had been quietly composing in the absence of a king worthy of it. The story that order was about to be restored, that the God of Babylon had not abandoned his city, that a righteous ruler was coming, who would do the things a righteous ruler was supposed to do. He had been studying the language he would need to tell that story for longer than the campaign had been running. The question was whether he had studied it well enough. The question was whether, when he stood inside the most symbolically loaded city in the ancient world, surrounded by priests who had devoted their lives to understanding the difference between genuine devotion and performed piety, he could do the thing he needed to do. Not just know the ritual. In a bit, he was moving toward Babylon, and the city was moving toward him in ways that neither of them had quite acknowledged yet. Chapter 6. Babylon opens. The Persian forces entered Babylon in October of 539 BC. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian administrative document written close enough to the events to be one of our most reliable sources for this period. Records, the campaign in the compressed matter-of-fact language of an official keeping records of things too significant to leave out. Cyrus's general Ugbaru led the Persian forces in Nabonidus, who had been outside the city, was captured shortly after. There was real fighting at Opis, to the north, where resistance was met with force, and the response was described in terms that make clear it was not gentle, but Babylon itself, the great city, the prize. The argument made of brick and glaze and divine appointment was taken without the kind of battle its walls should have made necessary. The gates were open. Now Cyrus stood at the entrance to the most symbolically important city in the ancient world. He could enter as a conqueror. The city was his by military right. He had the forces. He had the momentum. He could walk through those gates and do what conquerors had always done. Demonstrate his power through its most visible expression, and let the population draw the conclusions that populations always drew when a city fell. Or he could do something that had never been done before. He could enter as a Babylonian king, not by pretending to be something he was not, by performing the role that Babylonian tradition held legitimate kingship to require, with enough fluency and enough precision that the city's own theological framework would be the instrument through which it received him. He chose the second path. He came to the Exile, the great temple complex at the heart of Babylon, the house of Marduk, the place the priest had been tending since before dawn on the day the armies arrived, performing the morning rituals by habit and by faith in the practiced absence of certainty about what the day would bring. Cyrus entered. He was not alone. He was surrounded by Persian officers and the administrative apparatus of his campaign, men who had traveled with him from Persia, who had fought with him through Media and Lydia and the campaign that ended here. Persian men who worshipped other gods and spoke other languages and had no framework for what they were about to witness. He was also surrounded by the Babylonian priests who had come to observe whatever was going to happen next, men who had served in this temple their entire lives, who knew every stone of the place, who had performed the rituals in conditions of theological anxiety for years under a king who had failed to maintain his side of the relationship. They were watching the Persian king the way people watch when they have no way of knowing what they are about to see. The great hall of the Exile was vast in the way that only buildings designed to make human beings feel small can be vast. The columns, the filtered light, The smell of incense accumulated across generations of daily ritual. The statue of Marduk at the center of it. The physical presence of the god in whose name every legitimate king of Babylon had ruled for centuries. The room was not silent. Rooms that large are never silent. The priests were present. The officers were present. There were sounds from the city outside. The sounds of a city adjusting to a new reality, processing what had happened and what it meant and what came next. But the quality of the sound in the great hall had changed into something closer to held breath than to ordinary noise. Cyrus walked toward the statue. He walked the way a man walks, when he understands that every person in the room is reading every step he takes. Not performed confidence, something more controlled than that. The walk of a man who has been preparing for this moment longer than any of the people watching him have been watching him, who has thought through every element of what he is about to do, and has decided that thinking is finished and doing has begun. He stood before the statue of Marduk. In that moment, everything that came next depended on a single decision, not a military decision, not a strategic decision in the conventional sense, a human decision about who he was and what he was willing to become in order to accomplish what he had come here to accomplish. The priests of Marduk were watching a Persian conqueror stand before their god. They had spent their lives maintaining the relationship between Babylon and its divine patron. They had watched that relationship deteriorate under Nabonidus, watched the rituals go unperformed, watched the theological foundations of the city's identity erode year by year, while the man on the throne made choices that communicated, loudly and clearly, that he did not consider what they were maintaining to be worth maintaining. They did not know what this Persian king would do. Cyrus grasped the hands of the statue. This was the specific ritual act through which a Babylonian king received divine legitimacy. Not a symbolic gesture, not a diplomatic acknowledgement. The actual ceremony, performed correctly, in the temple, before the priesthood, in the form that the tradition required. Without it, a man could hold Babylon by force. With it, he was the king of Babylon, in every theologically complete sense that the city possessed. The priests watched a Persian conqueror do the thing their own king had failed to do. Perform the relationship. Show up. Stand in the place that the role required and do the thing the role required him to do. Not as someone tolerating a foreign tradition from a position of power, as someone who had studied that tradition well enough to inhabit it, who had come not to stand above Babylon's theological world, but to step inside it and occupy the position that world had been waiting for someone to occupy correctly. What passed through him in that moment we cannot know. The sources do not give us access to his private experience. The Babylonian priests watching him could observe his actions and his bearing and the fluency with which he moved through the ceremonial requirements. They could not observe what was happening beneath the surface of those actions. Was he moved? Did something genuine pass between him and the tradition he was performing? Did the weight of what he was doing, standing in the most sacred space in the ancient world and claiming through action to be the instrument of its God, land on him with any force beyond the political? Or was all of it the execution of a strategy so thoroughly prepared that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing itself? We do not know. We cannot know. What we can know is what happened next. The Cyrus cylinder was produced in the weeks and months following the entry into Babylon. It is a clay cylinder, inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform, written in the literary conventions of Babylonian royal inscription, buried in the foundations of the Exiles temple complex, according to the Babylonian tradition of placing commemorative objects inside the structures of important buildings. The British Museum, which houses it, describes it accurately as a Babylonian royal inscription. recording the conquest of Babylon and the restoration of sanctuaries and divine statues. This is what it is. It is not a declaration of universal principles. It is not a human rights document in any sense that the modern human rights framework implies. What the cylinder is, understood in its own context, is something more interesting than the modern label. It is a masterpiece of political communication in the specific language of Babylonian legitimacy. The cylinder opens not with Cyrus speaking about himself, but with Marduk speaking, the god of Babylon surveying the lands, finding the conditions in Babylon under Nabonidus intolerable, choosing Cyrus, calling him by name, directing him toward the city, the god himself endorsing the Persian king as his chosen ruler. Cyrus did not believe in Marduk in the way that the priests of the Exiles believed in Marduk. He was Persian. He worshipped Ahura Mazda. What he did was authorize a document produced within the political apparatus he now controlled, that spoke to the Babylonian population in the deepest language they possessed for understanding whether a ruler was legitimate. The cylinder goes further. It describes Cyrus ordering the return of divine statues to the cities from which Nabonidus had removed them. Gods that had been taken from their homes were being sent back. Temples that had been disrupted were being restored. These things actually happened. The gods were returned. The temples were restored. Across dozens of cities and cult centers, communities received back the physical objects that, in Babylonian religious understanding, represented the actual presence of their deity in their location. For each of those communities, this was not a policy. It was the restoration of their world. Now, the question that the cylinder raises, and that has to be held without easy resolution, was it genuine? Did Cyrus care, in any sense that went beyond political calculation, about the disruption to Babylonian religious life that Nabonidus had caused? Or was all of it the work of a man who had understood that religious identity was the most powerful political technology available in the ancient world, and was deploying it with the precision of an engineer who felt nothing that the technology was designed to produce? Here is what can be said, honestly. A man who spends decades genuinely attending to how other people understand their worlds does not emerge from that attention unchanged. The question of where genuine curiosity ends and strategic preparation begins is not always answerable even by the person whose curiosity it is. What the priest in the great hall saw that morning was a man who performed the relationship correctly, who showed up, who treated the things that Babylon held sacred as though they actually were sacred, and for the first time in years, the temple felt like it was in right relationship with its king. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods where the Jewish community had built its life across 2 generations of exile, word was spreading. The king who had entered Babylon had done something to the city that no one had expected. He had spoken to it in its own language. He had treated its foundations as worth preserving. He was returning the gods to their cities. If that was true, then perhaps the specific promise that their own tradition had been carrying for decades was not as impossible as the walls of Babylon had always made it seem. They were waiting to hear their name. They did not have to wait much longer. Chapter 7. The Exiles. Hear his name. This chapter does not begin with Cyrus. It begins with a woman who does not know his name yet. She was born in Babylon. Her mother was born in Babylon. Her grandmother was the one who remembered Jerusalem, who had been a child when the soldiers came and the city burned and the long walk began, who had carried the memory of the temple and the smell of cedar and the sound of the Levites singing in the early morning like a wound that never fully healed. The grandmother was gone now, but the memory was not gone. It had been transferred the way communities transfer the things they cannot afford to lose. In stories told at night, in prayers said in a language that Babylon did not speak, in the names given to children, in the specific texture of grief that passes from one generation to the next, not as information, but as identity. The woman born in Babylon knew Jerusalem the way you know a place you have never been, but have always been from. She knew the shape of the city from descriptions so detailed they had become more real to her than the streets outside her door. She knew which direction the temple faced. She knew the names of the gates. She knew the liturgy of a worship that had no physical home anymore, that existed only in memory and practice, and the fierce insistence of a community that refused to let the loss of the building mean the loss of the God who had inhabited it. She had built a life in Babylon because there was no alternative to building a life. You live where you are. You work. You raise children. You navigate the morong structures of the city around you with whatever skill you can manage. Some families in the Jewish community had found genuine success within Babylonian commercial and administrative structures. Later documents show them integrated into the economic life of Mesopotamia at sophisticated levels. They were not, as a community, living in poverty or isolation, but integration is not the same as belonging. And belonging, for a community that defined itself through a relationship with a specific land and a specific promise, was something the integration could never fully provide. The Psalms they carried captured the feeling with a rawness that no historical analysis can replicate. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. When we remembered Zion, on the willows there we hung up our lyres. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That is not poetry about a political situation. That is poetry about a specific kind of grief. The grief of people who are being asked to perform their wholeness in a place where their particular wholeness is homeless. For decades, that grief had nowhere to go. Then the news began to arrive. It came in pieces. The way news traveled in the ancient world. A merchant from the east, a soldier who had been near the campaign, someone who had heard from someone else. The Persian king had defeated the Medes, had taken Sardis, was moving toward Babylon, and was not moving like the kings who had come before. The community listened to these reports the way a community listens when it has learned through long experience that most news is either irrelevant or threatening. With attention, with the specific kind of hope that a people who have been disappointed many times learns to hold, carefully, not extended too far, tested against everything known before it is trusted. But something about what they were hearing was different from the ordinary news of empires rising and falling. The prophetic tradition they carried had said that exile would end. The texts they had preserved and argued over and transmitted to their children said that Babylon would fall, and that when it fell, the return would be possible. And among those texts, in what we now call 2nd Isaiah, something extraordinary had appeared. A name. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped. Isaiah 45 continues, I call you by your name, though you do not know me. That phrase carries its own astonishment inside it. The God of Israel explicitly acknowledging that Cyrus does not worship him, does not belong to the covenant, does not know the theological framework that is using him as its instrument, and reaching across that distance anyway, grasping his hand anyway, directing his steps anyway. When the news of how Cyrus had entered Babylon spread through the community, when the reports of what he was doing with the gods of other cities began to circulate, when word came that the temple establishment of Marduk had received him as a legitimate king, the people who had been living inside that prophetic text were not receiving information. They were receiving confirmation. And then came the decree, the edict of Cyrus, as recorded in the book of Ezra, states that the God of heaven had given Cyrus all the kingdoms of the earth and had charged him to build a house for God in Jerusalem. Therefore, any among the Jewish people who wished to return could do so, and those who remained were to support the returnees with silver and gold and goods and animals. And Cyrus himself was returning the vessels of the temple, the gold and silver implements that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem, 5,400 items, to be carried back to the city they had come from. Historians have examined the precise form and authenticity of this edict with care. A shorter version in Aramaic, appearing in Ezra chapter 6, is generally considered closer to the actual form of a Persian royal decree. The core of the matter, that Cyrus permitted the Jewish exiles to return to Judah and authorized the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, is consistent with everything we know about how he operated across all the territories he controlled. It fits the pattern, returning displaced communities to their proper locations, restoring the things that made them who they were, framing all of this as the will of the divine power, whose approval legitimized the rule of the king doing it. For the Babylonians, that divine power was Marduk. For the Jewish community, it was the God of Israel. Cyrus spoke both languages. He spoke them simultaneously, without apparent contradiction, because what he was speaking was not theology, it was legitimacy, and legitimacy, in his understanding, was a translation practice. The decree reached the woman born in Babylon on an ordinary morning. She sat with it for a long time. Not everyone was going back. This is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the return from exile. The decree permitted, it did not require, a significant portion of the Jewish community in Babylon chose to stay. They had built lives there. They had businesses and relationships and children who had been born into this world, and for whom Jerusalem was an inherited memory rather than a personal one. The choice was real, and it was hard in ways that a command would not have been hard, because a command removes the burden of deciding you obey or you resist, and the weight is external. But permission puts the weight inside you. Permission asks you to look at everything you have built and everything you have been carrying and decide which one is more truly yours. Her youngest son was 23 years old. He had grown up in Babylon, speaking Aramaic in the streets and Hebrew at home, navigating two worlds simultaneously in the way that exile communities develop as a survival skill across generations. He knew the Psalms. He knew the history. He knew the shape of the city from his mother's descriptions, which were her mother's descriptions, which were the descriptions of people who had stood on the walls and watched the smoke rise and begun the long walk away. He had decided to go. She gave him everything she could spare. Objects that had been in the family since before she was born. A lamp, a piece of cloth, things that had carried meaning too accumulated and too specific to translate into words. The portable record of a family's refusal, across 2 generations and 50 years of exile. To forget who it was. She watched him join the group forming for the journey. The people who had decided that the permission the Persian king had given was the permission they had been waiting for. She watched until she could not see him anymore. Then she went back inside. She did not know that her son's name would not be remembered. She did not know that the name that history would remember was Cyrus, that the story the world would tell about this moment would center on the king who issued the decree rather than on the people who received it and made the choice to walk toward it. From inside the community, from inside the experience of the people who walked that road, the story looked different. It looked like faithfulness, like a God who had not forgotten, like history moving toward what it had always been moving toward. Through the most unexpected of instruments, a Persian king who did not know the God he was serving, reaching across the distance of theology and language and culture to open a door he did not know the full meaning of. The exiles walked toward Jerusalem, toward ruins, toward an enormous amount of work, toward the hard, unglamorous, generation-long labor of rebuilding a city from its foundations, with limited resources and complicated politics, and the specific exhaustion that comes from trying to restore something that exists more completely in memory than in the past. Physical world waiting for you. But toward home, Cyrus never went to Jerusalem. There is no record of him visiting the territory of Judah, of seeing the city he had authorized, the rebuilding of having any direct encounter with the community whose return he had enabled. He gave the decree, he returned the vessels, he opened the door, and then he moved on to the next problem, the next territory, the next thing that the empire he was building required his attention, because that is what it means to be at the center of a system that large. You make the decision, and you do not get to witness what the decision means to the people it reaches. You see reports, you receive tribute, you manage the apparatus. The actual weight of what your decisions produce is happening somewhere beyond the edge of your direct perception. In the lives of people you will never meet, in the traditions of communities you will never fully understand from the inside. He never knew about the woman born in Babylon. He never knew about her son walking toward a city neither of them had ever seen. He never knew about the generations that would follow that son, building and losing and rebuilding, producing the texts and the traditions and the theological frameworks that would eventually shape the moral imagination of more than half the human beings who have ever lived. He just opened the door, and that is the weight of this chapter. Not the politics, not the question of what it means for a foreign king to be called the anointed of God, not the scholarly debate about the form and authenticity of the decree. The weight is in the walking, in the specific, irreplaceable, human experience of being given back by the choice of a powerful stranger who did not fully understand what he was giving, the thing that was taken from you before you were born. The woman born in Babylon stood at the edge of the city and watched her son until she could not see him anymore. Then she went back inside and lived her life in the only world she had ever known. Her son walked toward a world he had never seen, but had always been from. Both of them were living inside a story that a Persian king had made possible without fully understanding that he was writing it. He opened the door. He never stepped through it. That is the thing worth carrying out of this chapter. Not the greatness of the gesture, the distance between the person who makes a decision and the people who live inside its consequences, the gap between what power costs the person who holds it and what it means to the people it reaches. That gap is where most of human history actually lives. And Cyrus, the man who understood power better than almost anyone before him, was not exempt from it. He opened the door and moved on. Chapter 8. The Empire of Many Worlds. There is a temple in the city of Uruk. It has stood for generations. Its priests have performed the same rituals in the same sequence at the same hours since before anyone currently living can remember. The relationship between the community gathered around that temple and the deity understood to inhabit it is old, in the way that only things which have survived everything can be old. Empires have risen and fallen around this temple. Kings have come and gone. The name of the power that controls the territory has changed more than once within living memory. The rituals continue. Under Nabonidus, the god of that temple had been taken to Babylon. The statue that was understood to be the actual physical presence of the deity in that location had been removed from the place it had occupied for generations and relocated to the capital. The priests had continued their rituals as best they could, performing the liturgy in the presence of an absence, maintaining the forms of devotion in a temple that had been emptied of the presence of those forms were designed to honor. Under Cyrus, the god came home. That is the daily texture of what his governing philosophy produced. Not the grand gestures, not the decrees and the military campaigns and the theological performances in the Exiles, the ordinary fact, repeated across dozens of cities and cult centers across the territory he controlled, of a community receiving back the thing that had made its world feel like itself. He governed an empire. It is important to say that plainly before anything else, because the temptation when describing what Cyrus did is to reach for language that softens the edges of what it actually was. What he built was not a charitable organization. It was not a federation of equals, choosing voluntarily to cooperate. It was an empire, built by military force, sustained by the extraction of tribute, maintained by the credible threat of violence against those who refused compliance with its requirements. The populations under its authority did not choose to be there. They were there because Persian armies had arrived and the calculation of resistance had not favored resistance. That is the foundation beneath everything else. What they had, within that foundation, was a choice about how they would exist inside the arrangement that had been made for them, and within that constrained space. The range of choices Cyrus offered was genuinely wider than the range that any previous imperial power in that world had offered. He did not require them to become Persian. This sounds simple. In the context of the ancient world, in the specific environment of imperial power that he was operating in, it was revolutionary. Every major empire before Cyrus had made cultural assimilation a component of incorporation, to varying degrees. The Assyrians had been the most systematic, deliberately disrupting local identities through deportation and resettlement. Even less aggressive imperial powers had operated with the assumption that the culture of the center was the standard toward which the cultures of the periphery should aspire to move. Cyrus operated from a different assumption entirely. The cultures he incorporated were not inferior versions of Persian culture waiting to be improved. They were functional systems with their own internal logic, their own sources of meaning, their own ways of organizing human life that had proven durable enough to survive through generations. Disrupting those systems was not just morally questionable by whatever standards he held, it was administratively costly in ways that compounded over time. A population severed from its cultural foundations is a population in crisis. It requires management. It generates the specific kind of grievance that does not express itself in open rebellion, because open rebellion is too dangerous. But that manifests as a low-grade resistance to cooperation that makes governance harder at every level. A population allowed to maintain its cultural foundations is a population with something to lose under your rule. And populations with something to lose are, paradoxically, easier to govern than populations that have already lost everything. Consider what this actually looked like at the level of ordinary life in the territories he controlled. A Babylonian merchant in 538 BC woke up in the same house he had always lived in. He went to the same temple. He said the same prayers to the same God in the same language. He went to the market and conducted business using the same commercial practices. the same units of measure, the same legal frameworks that had governed trade in Babylon for generations. He paid taxes. He had always paid taxes. The name of the authority those taxes went to had changed. The rate and the mechanism were not dramatically different from what he had known under Nabonidus. His life was not free. It had never been free in the sense that modern political philosophy would recognize. He was a subject of an empire he had not chosen. But the texture of his daily existence, the things that made him feel like himself in the world, those were intact. A Lydian craftsman in Sardis, in the same year, woke up and went to a workshop that was still standing. The guild structures that organized his trade were still functioning. The religious practices of his community were still permitted. He paid tribute to a Persian administration rather than a Lydian one. The world he moved through every day was recognizable to him in ways that would not have been true if Sardis had been sacked in the Assyrian manner. These are not stories about freedom. Freedom was not on offer. These are stories about a specific and genuinely valuable experience. The experience of having your world disrupted at the political level without being disrupted at the level where identity lives. There is a phrase that captures what Cyrus actually achieved, one that requires neither calling him a liberator nor dismissing what he did as mere calculation. He governed by making the costs of his rule feel lower than its benefits. In the context of the ancient world, in the specific environment of imperial conquest he was operating in, that was not a low achievement. It was something that almost no ruler before him had managed consistently, at scale, across multiple, very different cultural contexts simultaneously. He built what might be called an empire in local clothes. Each territory he incorporated continued to look, from the inside of daily life, like a version of itself, not an unchanged version. The political structure had changed. The tribute went to Persia. The military answered to Persian command. But the local cultures, the local gods, the local administrative practices, the local forms of meaning-making that gave people their sense of who they were, those were not stripped away and replaced with Persian equivalents. The satrap system, the formal administrative structure of provinces governed by officials reporting to the Persian center, is largely credited to Darius, who succeeded Cyrus and formalized and systematized what had been applied more intuitively before. Darius deserves that credit. But the underlying principle was Cyrus's. He kept Median administrative structures when he absorbed Media. He worked with Babylonian priestly and commercial institutions rather than dismantling them. He did not impose a Persian administrative language on territories that had their own functioning bureaucratic traditions. He also used local elites as the actual administrators of local affairs. Partly practical, he did not have enough Persian administrators to govern an empire stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia effectively, but also something beyond practicality, the recognition that people tolerate a system more readily when the face of that system is familiar. But here is where the accounting has to be honest about what all of this was and what it was not. It was not justice. The populations who experienced Cyrus's rule as more tolerable than what had come before were not experiencing freedom. They were experiencing a better quality of subjugation. The Babylonian merchant waking up in his own house was still paying tribute he had not agreed to pay, still living under the authority of a power that had arrived with armies and would send armies back if compliance was withdrawn. The improvement was real. The gratitude was genuine. And neither the improvement nor the gratitude dissolved the underlying structure that made both of them possible. Cyrus understood this, or understood something close to it. The evidence of his actual behavior suggests a man who had thought carefully about the relationship between rulers and the people they ruled, who had concluded that the most durable form of power was the form that gave people reasons to cooperate rather than reasons to resist, and who had built his governing approach around that conclusion. But the conclusion was reached in the service of building an empire. The durability he was seeking was not the durability of a just social order. It was the durability of an imperial structure that could sustain itself across vast distances and multiple cultures, without requiring the kind of continuous, violent suppression that the Assyrian model had demanded. He was, in the fullest and most honest sense of the term, a conqueror who had found a more efficient way to conquer. What made him different from the conquerors before him was not that he had transcended the logic of empire. It was that he had found a version of that logic sophisticated enough to feel from the inside like something else, and feeling from the inside like something else is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that explains why Babylon did not burn, why the exiles went home, why the god of Uruk came back. The feeling that you are being governed rather than managed, that the system around you knows your name, that the things that make you who you are have been acknowledged as worth preserving. That feeling is not justice, but it is something genuinely different from its absence, and something genuinely different from its absence, delivered at scale, consistently, across one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen, was what Cyrus the Great actually built. Now, the question that the building itself was always going to raise: what happens when the person who understood why it all worked is no longer there to make it work? Cyrus was aging. He had been at war, more or less continuously, for the entire length of his reign. The eastern boundaries of the empire were not yet settled. There were campaigns still to run and territories still to bring into the system, and the specific quality of attention he had brought to every previous situation was being asked, again, to do its work, in conditions it had not previously encountered. He was moving east, into the landscapes of Central Asia, where the edges of the known world began to blur into something that the intelligence and cultural fluency that had served him everywhere else could not fully prepare him for. Because the East was not like the West. It did not have cities with temples and established theological frameworks and priestly establishments ready to receive a ruler who had done his homework. It had open steppe and nomadic peoples and ways of living that did not operate according to any of the frameworks Cyrus had spent his life learning to read. He was the most sophisticated political intelligence the ancient world had produced, and he was riding toward the one kind of terrain that sophistication could not fully map. Chapter 9. The Fragile Inheritance. Cyrus died somewhere in Central Asia, around 530 BC. The exact circumstances are lost to us in a way that goes beyond ordinary historical uncertainty. This is not the familiar situation where sources disagree about details while agreeing about the broad shape of what happened. This is something more complete than that. The sources that describe the death of Cyrus are so different from each other, so shaped by the purposes of the people who recorded them, so filtered through layers of retelling and interpretation and the specific needs of the traditions that preserved them, that reconstructing the actual event from the available accounts is less like reading history and more like trying to understand a landscape from 4 photographs taken from 4 different angles in 4 different kinds of light by 4 photographers who each had a completely different idea of what the landscape was supposed to mean. Herodotus gives us the most dramatic version. Cyrus was campaigning against a people called the Massagetae, a nomadic people who lived beyond the Araxes River. Their queen was named Tomaris. She sent him a message before the campaign began, telling him to stay on his own side of the river and govern his own people and leave hers alone. He did not stay. He crossed the river. Her son was captured in an engagement and killed himself in captivity rather than remain a prisoner. Cyrus assembled her forces and fought him in a battle that Herodotus describes as the fiercest he knows of among non-Greek peoples. Cyrus was killed. Cyrus found his body, filled a skin with blood, and placed his head inside it. She had told him he would have his fill of blood, and she was keeping her word. Ctesias tells a completely different story, involving a different people and a different sequence of events and a different manner of death. Xenophon's Cyropedia gives him a peaceful death in bed. His sons gathered around him, delivering a final speech about the nature of the soul. What we can say with confidence is this, and only this: Cyrus died on campaign in the northeastern territories of his empire, almost certainly in combat or in its immediate aftermath, sometime around 530 BC. He had been ruling for approximately 29 years since his defeat of Astyages. He was buried at Pasargadae, in a tomb that still stands today, a simple stone structure on a raised platform, restrained in a way that is almost startling given the scale of what the man inside it had built. No catalogue of conquests carved into the stone, no images of subjugated peoples at his feet. The inscription that Alexander the Great's companions recorded as being there said this: "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." Whether that inscription is historically accurate or a later composition placed in his voice is debated by scholars, but its restraint fits everything else we know about how he presented himself to the world. He was gone, and the question that his entire reign had been quietly deferring was now unavoidable. Could what he had built survive him? Cambyses, his son, took the throne. Cambyses was not unprepared for power in the conventional sense. He had served as regent in Babylon during some of his father's campaigns. He successfully conquered Egypt in 525 BC. That required real military skill and real political judgment. But the tradition that formed around Cambyses in Egypt was devastating. He was remembered as the king who killed the sacred bull, Apis, who attacked Egyptian religious institutions, who behaved toward Egyptian culture with a contempt that sources describe in terms that would have been completely unrecognizable to anyone who had watched his father enter Babylon. Modern historians approach these accounts with appropriate caution. The Apis bull story is not confirmed by contemporary Egyptian evidence in ways that make it certainly true. The picture of Cambyses as erratic and sacrilegious was useful to too many different parties to be taken entirely at face value. But here is the thing about that caution. Even if every specific charge against Cambyses is exaggerated, even if the religious desecrations attributed to him are largely the product of hostile sources, the fact that these stories formed around him and not around his father tells you something real. The stories formed because they were believable. You cannot build a sustained historical reputation for religious contempt around a king who behaved the way Cyrus behaved. The reputation attaches because something in the underlying reality invited it. What seems most likely is not that Cambyses was a monster. It is that he was a man who did not have his father's specific gift, and who governed in its absence in ways that revealed starkly and consequentially how much the gift had mattered. Cyrus could enter a foreign cultural framework and operate within it with genuine fluency. He could read what a community needed in order to experience his rule as something other than pure imposition. He could perform the relationship between ruler and ruled in the specific language that each community used to evaluate Whether that relationship was legitimate, this capacity had not come from nowhere. It had been built across decades. It had been formed in the specific experience of growing up at the edge of a world organized around power he did not hold, watching how that power presented itself and where the gap was between the presentation and the reality. It was, in the deepest sense, the product of a particular life, lived in a particular way. Cambyses had not lived that life. He had grown up at the center of the empire his father had built. He had learned the administrative skills that succession required. He had learned military command and political management and the formal protocols of imperial governance. He had not learned to see the room from outside it. And Egypt required exactly that capacity. The result was the specific kind of governing failure that comes not from malice, but from an inability to read what the room requires. The failure to understand that the gap between your intentions and the experience of the people you are governing is not something that administrative competence alone can close. Cambyses died in 522 BC. Darius, from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid family, took the throne, suppressed a series of rebellions, and proved himself a ruler of a different kind. Darius was the builder in the institutional sense. He formalized the satrap system. He standardized the tribute structure. He built the royal road network. He commissioned the palace complex at Persepolis. He was, by many measures, a more effective administrator than Cyrus, but he was not Cyrus. Cyrus had governed as though the ongoing consent of the governed was something he needed to continuously earn. Darius governed as though the system he had built was sufficient to sustain itself. This was probably the wiser approach to the practical problem of governing an empire over time. Empires that depend entirely on the personality of their founder are fragile in ways that empires with strong institutional structures are not. But in solving that problem, something was lost that the solution could not replace. The empire Cyrus built had felt, to the people inside it, like the expression of a particular intelligence that was paying attention to them. The empire Darius built felt like a system. Both were genuine achievements, but only one of them had made the priests of Marduk feel that their God had sent them a king. Only one had made the Jewish community in Babylon feel that the God of Israel was moving through history. Only one had made Croesus feel that the man who had defeated him had seen something in him worth preserving. The institutional empire outlasted Cyrus by 2 centuries. It produced capable rulers and incapable ones, and survived crises that should have ended it. It eventually succumbed to Alexander, who swept through it like a force of nature in the 300s BC. When Alexander stood at the tomb at Pasargadae and found it had been robbed, he was furious. He had the robbers punished. He had the tomb restored and sealed. This was not a conqueror paying formal respects to a defeated predecessor. This was a man who had been reading about Cyrus since his youth, who had carried the Cyropedia through his campaigns, who understood himself to be, in some important and perhaps not fully articulable sense, in pursuit of what Cyrus had done, not the territory, not the administrative structure. The quality of relationship between a ruler and the people he governed, the specific and rare thing that Cyrus had achieved and that Alexander, for all his extraordinary ability, was not consistently able to replicate, because it was not replicable by instruction. It could only be grown slowly through the specific kind of life experience that Cyrus had had, and that no amount of power or education or inherited greatness could substitute for. Empires can reproduce systems. They cannot reproduce the quality of a particular mind, paying a particular kind of attention. The empire outlived the man by 200 years. The image of the man outlived the empire, and that image was already traveling in multiple directions, carried by communities that each had their own version of it, each needing it for reasons the others would not have fully understood. Chapter 10. The Many Cyruses. He had been dead less than a generation when the rewriting began. Not falsification, not the deliberate distortion of a record by people who knew they were lying about it. Something more interesting and more human than that. The process by which a real person, after they die, begins to be converted into what the living need them to be. The process by which history becomes mythology, not through dishonesty, but through the pressure of necessity. The way water finds the shape of whatever container holds it. The way meaning attaches itself to the figures who seem capable of carrying it. Every civilization that had encountered Cyrus began, almost immediately after his death, to produce its own version of him, not because they were confused about the facts, because the facts alone were not sufficient for what they needed the figure to do. The Cyrus that Babylon remembered was not the same as the Cyrus that Jerusalem remembered. The Cyrus that Athens remembered was not the same as the Cyrus that Persepolis remembered. And the Cyrus that the modern world has inherited is a composite of all of them, plus the specific needs of the centuries that came between, filtered through languages and traditions and political purposes that Cyrus himself would not have recognized. Understanding that composite, understanding which parts of it are close to the historical person and which parts are what subsequent generations needed him to be, is not merely an academic exercise. It is the only way to understand why his name is still spoken. Begin with Babylon. The Babylonian memory of Cyrus was shaped most directly by the cylinder and by the priestly tradition of the Exiles. In that memory, Cyrus was the king that Marduk had chosen to correct the disorder that Nabonidus had created. He was not a foreign conqueror in the Babylonian telling. He was a legitimate ruler whose legitimacy derived from divine selection, expressed through the proper performance of the rituals that defined Babylonian kingship. This memory served the Babylonian priestly establishment in specific ways. It allowed them to narrate the transition of power without narrating their own defeat. If Marduk had chosen Cyrus, then the priests who served Marduk were the institution through which the divine will had expressed itself. The conquest became a correction, not something done to Babylon by an external force, but something done for Babylon by its own God, using an external instrument. The cylinder describes actual things that actually happened. Gods were returned to their cities. Temples were restored. Populations that had been displaced were allowed to return to their places of origin. These things occurred. The theological framing around them was a construction designed to serve political purposes. The actions themselves were not constructed. They were real. The Babylonian memory of Cyrus was the memory of a city that had been given a reason to accept its own conquest. And that reason, whatever its origins in political calculation, had allowed the city to continue being what it was. Then the memory that has traveled farthest and shaped the most lives, the Jewish memory of Cyrus. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus appears in the books of Ezra, Chronicles, Isaiah, and Daniel. The treatment he receives is unlike the treatment given to any other foreign ruler in the entire corpus of Israelite scripture. He is described as an instrument of divine purpose, a king whose actions were directed by the God of Israel toward ends that God had intended. Isaiah 45 is the theological center of this tradition. The Ezra narrative is its practical expression. Together, they construct a picture of a foreign king who was, in the deepest sense that the Israelite tradition possessed, on the right side of history. Not because he belonged to that tradition, But because God, in the understanding, the tradition was developing in exile, was not limited by the boundaries of the covenant in the instruments he chose to work through. That is an extraordinary theological claim. The Hebrew Bible is not a document that makes such claims casually, against the background of its catalogue of failed kings and fallen cities. The treatment of Cyrus is without parallel. He is the exception. The one case in the entire biblical record in which the tradition's deepest category of divine appointment is applied to someone who, by every conventional measure, was outside the tradition entirely. The theological questions this raises have never been fully resolved within the communities whose scripture contains this passage. Jewish interpretation, across the centuries, developed various frameworks for understanding what it meant. Christian tradition inherited the passage and found in it a pattern that resonated with its own developing theology. The argument continues. It has continued for 25 centuries. That is not the fate of a figure who was simply a useful political ally at a convenient moment. That is the fate of someone whose actual actions were consequential enough to earn a permanent place inside a tradition's deepest framework for understanding what history means. Now, the Greek Cyrus. The Greek world encountered Cyrus most directly through Herodotus, but it is Xenophon's Cyropedia that shaped the Greek and later the European political imagination most deeply and most durably. Xenophon wrote in the aftermath of the failures of Athenian democracy and Spartan militarism. He turned to the figure of Cyrus because Cyrus represented a possibility that Greek political life seemed constitutionally unable to realize: power exercised with wisdom, an empire that functioned because its ruler had earned the loyalty of the people inside it, rather than simply imposed compliance. The Cyrus of the Cyropedia is patient, generous, wise, capable of inspiring loyalty rather than just demanding it. He is not a historical portrait. He is a philosophical ideal given historical clothing. That portrait traveled through Rome and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, until it sat on Thomas Jefferson's shelf while he was thinking about what governance should look like. The Library of Congress confirms Jefferson's ownership of 2 copies of the Cyropedia. The ideas were present, circulating, part of the intellectual environment in which the American founding was conceived 2,000 years after Xenophon wrote. The ideal he had constructed around Cyrus's figure was still active in the political imagination of people trying to think about what power should look like when exercised well. Then, the Iranian Cyrus. In contemporary Iran, Cyrus occupies a space in national identity that is both profound and contested. He is understood as the founding figure of Persian imperial greatness. The Pasargadae tomb complex is a site of national significance. The name Cyrus remains one of the most common given names in Iran. His image has been invoked by Iranian political movements across the ideological spectrum, which tells you less about Cyrus than about the power of founding figures to be claimed by whoever needs a legitimate ancestor for their particular vision. Finally, the International Cyrus. In 1971, the Shah of Iran used the cylinder as the centerpiece of a celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. The cylinder was presented, and has been presented in various contexts since, as the first charter of human rights in history. The British Museum describes the cylinder accurately as a Babylonian royal inscription, recording the conquest of Babylon and the restoration of sanctuaries and divine statues. It does not use the Human Rights Charter label as its primary characterization, because applying a 20th century framework to a 6th century BC Babylonian text requires a category error that clarity does not permit, but the actions the cylinder describes were real improvements in the lives of real people. The return of gods to their cities was not symbolic. The permission for exiled communities to return was not an empty gesture. These things changed lives. Whatever the label, the underlying reality that the label is reaching for is real. All of these Cyruses, the Babylonian, the Jewish, the Greek, the Iranian, the international, are partial. Each captures something true about the historical figure and adds something that the tradition or the political moment needed. Together, they form the fullest picture available of a person who was remarkable enough to generate all of them. The question to sit with is not which memory is truest. What does it mean that so many different traditions, separated by language and theology and geography and centuries, looked at the same historical figure and each found something that spoke directly to their deepest understanding of what power should look like? That is not the legacy of a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time. That is the legacy of a man who understood something about human beings that was true enough and deep enough and rare enough to be recognized across every cultural boundary and every theological divide and every distance of time that has accumulated between his life and ours. He understood that people do not ultimately follow power. They follow the story that power tells about who they are. And he told that story in every language available to him, better than anyone before him. Chapter 11. The Man Behind the Memory. We have spent 10 chapters building a picture of Cyrus. We have followed him from the margins of the Median Empire to the throne of the ancient world. We have watched him absorb Media without destroying it, defeat Lydia and choose not to kill its king, enter Babylon through its theological front door rather than its military one, authorize the return of the Jewish exiles to a city he would never visit, build an empire that governed by allowing its subjects to remain who they were. We have watched the memory of him travel across 25 centuries and across every cultural boundary available, becoming different things to different people, accumulating layers of meaning that the historical figure could not have anticipated and would probably not have fully recognized in himself. Now, before the closing, it is worth doing something that legend almost never permits: stepping back from the memory, stripping away, as much as the distance allows, the theological framings and the philosophical constructions and the political uses and the accumulated weight of all that interpretation, and asking, as plainly and as honestly as 25 centuries of distance permits, who was this man? Not what he represented, not what he accomplished, not what he meant to the people who came after him. Who was he? The actual human being who woke up every morning inside the specific circumstances of his life and made decisions that other people then had to live with. Who felt something when he stood before the statue of Marduk in the Exiles, though we cannot know what that something was. Who looked at Croesus on the pyre and gave an order that none of the people watching expected him to give. Who issued a decree that opened a door for a community he would never meet, in a city he would never visit, producing consequences he could not have foreseen and would not live to see. We will not recover him completely. The distance is too great. The sources are too shaped by purposes other than neutral observation. But there are things we can say. He was patient in a way that is genuinely rare in people who have the ability to take what they want by force. This comes through not as a single data point, but as a consistent pattern across the entire length of his reign. He did not rush Media when he could have moved faster. He did not press his advantage against Croesus in ways that might have produced a quicker but more destructive outcome. He waited outside Babylon while the internal conditions of the city shifted in his favor, rather than attempting the kind of direct assault that the walls seemed to demand. He built his relationships within the median military and noble class over years, rather than trying to convert the disaffected in the immediate run-up to his rebellion. Patience of that kind, sustained over decades by a person with real military power, is not a natural default. It is a choice made over and over again in the face of situations that offer faster and more immediately satisfying alternatives, and choosing it with that consistency across that much time and that many different situations suggests something deeper than tactical patience deployed situationally when the calculation favors it. It suggests something closer to a governing conviction, a belief held at a level deeper than deliberate strategy, that the slow way of building things was usually the right way, because the slow way built things that lasted. He was curious about the people he governed in a way that goes beyond what strategic necessity alone can explain or produce. The fluency with which he operated within Babylonian theological frameworks did not come from a briefing. It came from the kind of sustained, serious attention that produces real understanding, rather than the ability to perform understanding. You do not learn to speak a culture's deepest language without spending real time inside it, not reading about it from outside, living with it, carrying it around, letting it change the way you see the other things you know. He also was genuinely restrained in how he exercised the power he accumulated, not restrained in the sense of refusing to use force. He used force when he needed to. The fighting at Opis was real. The conquest of Lydia was real. He was not a pacifist, operating in a world that rewarded pacifism, but restrained in the specific sense of consistently declining to take the maximum available extraction from the situations he won. He could have killed Astyages. He did not. He could have killed Croesus. He did not. He could have looted the temples of Babylon. He did not. At every point where the conventional logic of conquest suggested a more aggressive option, he chose a less aggressive one, and he chose it consistently, as the pattern of his entire reign. The question that the record raises but cannot fully resolve is the one that sits at the moral center of everything. Was it sincere? When he stood in the Esagila and grasped the hands of the statue of Marduk, was something genuine happening in him? When he authorized the return of the Jewish exiles, was he moved by something that could be called genuine concern for the suffering of a people he had never met? Or was it the flawless execution of a performance so thoroughly prepared that it had become indistinguishable from the thing it was performing? We do not know. We cannot know. And here is what is worth saying about that not knowing. The most sophisticated forms of political intelligence are not cold in the way that we imagine pure calculation to be cold. The person who has developed the ability to read what a community needs and to provide it consistently and at scale has, in developing that ability, spent years genuinely attending to what communities need. That kind of sustained, genuine attention is not a performance of caring. It is a form of caring, whatever its origins. What the record shows is behavior, consistent, sustained, costly in the short term, behavior that produced genuine benefit for the people it reached, behavior that could have been different at almost every significant juncture, behavior that required, whatever its motivation, the kind of attention to other human beings that most people with that much power never bother to develop. And then there is the question that the behavior raises. The question that is the tragic dimension of everything he built. Why could no one else do it? Not no one, ever, in all of history. But why could no one do it after him? In the empire he had built, among the people who had inherited his position and his resources and the explicit example of how he had operated, Cambyses could not do it. Darius, for all his administrative genius, did not do it in the same way. Alexander, who had literally read the manual, who had studied Xenophon's account of Cyrus's methods with the focused attention of someone trying to understand how the thing worked, could not consistently do it at scale. Why? Because the thing that made it work was not a method. It was a formation. It was the specific product of a specific life lived in a specific way. The experience of growing up at the edge of a world organized around power you did not hold. The decades of watching how that power presented itself and where the gap was between the presentation and the reality. The patient accumulation of understanding about how different kinds of people organized their relationship with authority and meaning and the divine. You cannot read about that formation and thereby acquire it. You cannot decide to implement it as a policy. You cannot inherit it, or teach it, or transmit it through administrative systems or legal codes. It had to be lived, and Cyrus had lived it. His son had not. His successors had not. Alexander had read about it, but had not lived the formation that produced the capacity he was reading about. This is the tragedy at the center of everything Cyrus built. Not the military defeats that did not happen. Not the empire that eventually ended 2 centuries after him. As empires always end, the tragedy is smaller and more precise than that. He created something extraordinary that depended on him. He created an approach to power so sophisticated, so demanding, so rooted in the specific formation of a specific person's life, that it could not survive the transition to anyone who had not lived some version of that formation. And the empire he built, which was large enough and strong enough and institutionally sophisticated enough to survive the loss of that approach for 2 centuries, did survive it. It went on producing capable rulers and important events and lasting consequences, but it never again produced a Cyrus. Not because the materials were not there, not because the world stopped needing what he had provided, but because the materials required to produce a Cyrus were not the materials that empires know how to select for or cultivate or recognize when they appear. Empires select for power, for military effectiveness, for administrative capability, for the ability to hold things together under pressure. They do not select for the specific kind of attention that Cyrus paid to the people beneath him. They do not cultivate the formation that produces the ability to enter a foreign cultural framework and operate within it with genuine fluency. They do not value, in the systems they build and the successes they prepare, the particular quality of patience and curiosity and restrained power that made everything else possible. He was, in the deepest sense, an accident of formation that produced a capacity the world has never quite been able to reproduce on purpose. That is not a comfortable thought. It is an honest one. He was not a saint. He was not a humanitarian in the modern sense. He was not innocent of the violence that building an empire requires. He was a conqueror who had found a more sophisticated way to conquer, a man who had learned to make subjugation feel, from the inside, like something that it was not. And yet, the temples were restored. The gods came home. The exiles walked toward Jerusalem. The priest in the Azagala felt, for the first time in years, that the relationship between his temple and its king was right. These things happened. They mattered to real people in ways that the historical record preserves with enough clarity to be trusted. That is worth something. That is worth quite a lot. It does not resolve the moral complexity. It does not dissolve the fact of empire or the coercion that empire required. It does not turn a sophisticated conqueror into a saint, but it is real, and it is rare, and it is the thing that 25 centuries of memory, in all its varied and partial and sometimes distorted forms, has been refusing to let go of the man who understood, better than almost anyone before or since, that the people beneath power are not an obstacle to be managed. They are a world to be entered, and if you enter it honestly, if you learn its language and respect its foundations and speak to it in the terms it uses to understand itself, it will give you something that no army and no system of walls and no mechanism of surveillance and punishment has ever been able to produce by force. It will call you its own. Babylon called him its own. Jerusalem called him its own. The Greek world called him its own. The Persian heartland called him its own. Communities separated by language and theology and geography and centuries of mutual incomprehension, each found in him a figure they could claim. That is not coincidence. That is the record of a man who did the work that power most often refuses to do, who paid the kind of attention that most rulers never pay, and then he died at the edge of the world he had built, in terrain that did not have rooms to read, in a campaign that the sources cannot agree on, for reasons that remain, like so much of what is most important about him, permanently beyond our full understanding. The empire went on, the memory traveled, and the question of who he really was, beneath all the memories and all the needs that those memories served, remains open, as it probably should. Some people are too consequential to be fully explained. They can only be approached. Go back to the woman born in Babylon, not to Cyrus, not to the cylinder, not to the armies or the theology or the philosophical tradition that would spend 2,000 years trying to name what he had done. Back to her. She is standing at the edge of the city, watching her son walk away from everything she built her life inside. The morning is ordinary. The streets behind her are the streets she has always known. The language she hears from the market is the language she grew up speaking, not the language her grandmother prayed in, not the language her son uses when he reads from the scrolls on the Sabbath, but the language of the city that held her people for 50 years and shaped them in ways that going home will not undo. Her son is carrying what she gave him: the lamp, the cloth, the objects that a family keeps because they are the things worth keeping, the portable record of a family's refusal across 2 generations and 50 years to forget who it was. He is walking toward a city he has never seen. She watches until she cannot see him anymore. Then she goes back inside. Hold that image for a moment before moving past it, not because it is dramatic, because it is true, because it is the kind of truth that the large words, empire and conquest and restoration and legacy and greatness, do not reach, the kind of truth that only lives in the specific and the unrepeatable. A woman at the edge of a city, a son walking away, a lamp carried toward a place that exists, for now, more completely in memory than in stone. That moment is what the decree produced, not the geopolitics of it, not the theological argument about what it means for a foreign king to be named the anointed of God, not the scholarly debate about the precise form and authenticity of the edict recorded in Ezra, not the larger question of what Cyrus intended and what he understood and what he felt when he gave the order. A human moment that would not have happened without him. A son walking toward home. He never saw it. He was already somewhere else, already moving toward the next campaign, the next territory, the next problem, requiring the attention of the man who had made himself responsible for the largest empire the ancient world had seen. He issued the decree and moved on because that is what it means to be at the center of a system that large. You do not get to witness the consequences of your decisions at the human scale, where they are most real. You see reports. You receive tribute. You manage the apparatus. The actual weight of what your decisions produce is happening somewhere beyond the edge of your direct perception, in the lives of people you will never meet, carried forward in traditions you will never fully understand from the inside. He never knew about the woman born in Babylon. He never knew about her son walking toward Jerusalem. He never knew about the generations that would follow that son, building and losing and rebuilding, producing the texts and the traditions and the theological frameworks that would eventually shape the moral imagination of more than half the human beings who have ever lived. He just opened the door and moved on. That gap between what a decision costs the person who makes it and what it means to the people it reaches is one of the most vertiginous things about power at the scale Cyrus exercised it. He issued a decree that took him a morning. The consequences of that decree are still unfolding 25 centuries later, and it raises the question that this whole story has been circling. The question that deserves to be named directly before the closing is complete. Was Cyrus good? Not great, not historically significant, not strategically brilliant, not patient and curious and culturally fluent across more civilizational boundaries than any ruler before him. Good, in the simple, demanding, frequently disappointing sense of that word. The honest answer is that he was both good and not good, and that both of those things are true at the same time, and that the simultaneous truth of them is not a contradiction to be resolved, but a tension to be held. He was good in his effects. The communities that received his policies were genuinely better off than they would have been under the alternative. The temples were restored. The gods came home. The exiles walked toward Jerusalem. The markets kept functioning. The cultural foundations that give human life its specific texture were preserved rather than destroyed across a vast and diverse empire. These are real goods. They happened to real people. They altered real lives in ways that those people experienced as significant and meaningful, and sometimes as something approaching miraculous. He was also a conqueror. The people who received his goodness did not choose to be in a position where his goodness was what was on offer. They were there because Persian armies had come, and the calculation of resistance had not favored resistance. They were subjects of an empire they had not chosen, paying tribute they had not agreed to pay, living under the authority of a power that had arrived with armies and would return with armies if compliance was withdrawn. The goodness was real. The coercion inside which the goodness was delivered was also real, and neither one cancels the other. These two things coexist. And the reason that their coexistence is worth sitting inside, rather than resolving in one direction or the other, is that it is the coexistence that most of us live inside most of the time. Most of the genuine goods that have been produced in human history have been produced inside systems that were not just. Most of the real improvements in the conditions of human life have been delivered by people and through institutions that were simultaneously doing things that the improvements do not redeem. The gap between the good that is possible within a given system and the justice that the system itself lacks is not a temporary problem waiting to be solved. It is one of the permanent, uncomfortable features of the world as it actually is. Cyrus did not transcend that gap. He lived inside it. He maximized the good available within the constraints of what he was, which was a conqueror building an empire, while remaining, inescapably, a conqueror building an empire. What he did within those constraints was genuine and remarkable and worth the attention we have been giving it. He understood something about human beings that most rulers never learn, that most people in positions of power over others never bother to develop, because developing it requires a kind of sustained and disciplined attention to other people's inner lives. That power tends to make feel unnecessary. He understood that people need to feel seen, not just managed, not just provided for, not just protected from the worst outcomes. They need to feel that the system they are living inside knows their name, that the things that make them who they are have been acknowledged as worth preserving, that the power above them has looked at them clearly enough to understand what they actually are. That feeling is not justice. It is not freedom. It does not resolve the fundamental asymmetry between the governed and those who govern, but it is something genuinely different from its absence. Cyrus provided that feeling, imperfectly and within the constraints of empire, at a scale and with a consistency that the ancient world had not previously seen from a ruler of his power. And in doing so, he left behind a question that has not been answered in 25 centuries, not a historical question, a practical one. If this is what power looks like when it is exercised well, at its most sophisticated and its most humane within the constraints of what it is, why is it so rare? Why, in 2,500 years of political history, with this example available for anyone to study and anyone to attempt to follow, has no one managed to consistently replicate it at anything approaching comparable scale? The answer that the record suggests is uncomfortable, because it cannot be replicated, not by method, not by intention, not by reading about it or deciding to implement it or inheriting the position of the person who did it. It can only be grown, slowly, through the specific formation of a specific kind of life, through the experience of powerlessness that teaches you to read power from the outside, through the patience that only develops in people who have had to wait, through the curiosity about other people's worlds that runs deep enough to survive success and position, and the accumulated pressure of everyone around you to simply use what you have rather than understand what you are using it on. That formation is rare. It is not the formation that power selects for. It is not what empires cultivate in their successors, or what institutions recognize in the people they promote. It is the formation of the edge, of the margin, of the person who grew up watching a world they did not yet belong to and learned, in the watching, to see it more clearly than anyone on the inside ever could. Cyrus had that formation, and he used it to build the largest empire the ancient world had seen, and then he died at the edge of that empire, in terrain that did not reward the specific capacities his formation had built, in a campaign that the sources cannot agree on, in circumstances that history has not managed to recover, and the empire went on without him, and the memory of him traveled farther than the empire ever reached. Now there is one final thing to say, the thing that this story has been moving toward, and that belongs at the very end. Cyrus never went to Jerusalem. He authorized the rebuilding. He returned the temple vessels. He issued the decree that the community of exiles received on an ordinary morning and sat with for a long time before deciding what to do with it. He opened the door. He never stepped through it. There is something in that fact that resists easy interpretation, and that is worth leaving unresolved, because it captures something true about what it means to exercise power at the scale he exercised it. The most significant things you do are the things you will never fully see the meaning of. The consequences that matter most happen in rooms you will not enter, in lives you will not witness, in traditions you will not live long enough to see fully formed. You make the decree, you return the vessels, you open the door, and then you move on to the next campaign. You do not get to see what the door was for. The woman born in Babylon saw it Her son saw it, walking across hundreds of miles of difficult country toward a city he had never seen, carrying a lamp and a piece of cloth and the accumulated weight of 2 generations of a family's refusal to forget. The generations that followed saw it. They built the city and lost it and rebuilt it and produced the books that carried the memory of what had happened and why. And those books traveled and those memories traveled, and the tradition that grew from all of it became one of the shaping forces of human civilization in ways that none of the people involved could have foreseen. He just opened the door. And that, finally, is the most honest thing that can be said about what he was. Not a liberator in the complete sense, not a conqueror in the simple sense, not a humanitarian before his time, or a strategic genius who cared nothing for the humans his strategy moved. Not the saint of the cylinder, or the monster of hostile tradition, or the philosopher king of the Cyropedia, or the founding father of a nation, or the first author of something we can cleanly call human rights. A man who understood that the people beneath power are not an obstacle, and acted on that understanding, imperfectly, inside the constraints of what he was, with a consistency and a scale that the ancient world had not previously seen. A man who opened doors he would never walk through, and trusted that what was on the other side was worth opening them for. He was right. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is the thing that 25 centuries have not been able to forget.